There we go. I'll make sure that I do my thing, do the right thing. So welcome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we have got members of the Trust Framework ecosystem we're very lucky to have. And I'll let everyone go around and introduce themselves. So because I won't get anything wrong then if introduce yourself. I think that's the best way. And then we've got a number of questions that we will be discussing. Quite a sort of try and be a bit informal. So hopefully it'll be a very interesting webinar. Panel discussion, not webinar. Right. So Victoria, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Really great to see everyone here today. I'm Victoria, and I'm a policy advisor working for the shiny new Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Make sure I get that the right way around. And I'm a policy advisor working on the UK Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework. And I particularly lead our work on inclusion in the trust framework, the data protection risks and risks work in general.
Thank you very much. Mark, you're next on my screen, so we'll go with you.
Thank you. I'm Mark Roberts. I'm the Business Development Director for Identity and Fraud at GBG. I've been with the business 14 years and I'm really excited to talk to everybody today.
Thank you very much. And Dion.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dion Allen. I work with BSI in the IoT team as the certification manager. That team is responsible for our product in the UK DIATF framework. I've been certification manager with the team for just over 2 years, and I personally was the certification manager who oversees the UK DIATF application for SQR. So I'm really happy to be here and to share my experiences about what we've been seeing in the market and also what we've been seeing with regards to client feedback.
Amazing, thank you so much. And I'm Shelley Langan-Newton. I'm Chief Exec of SQR. We are a digital identity provider, and we also have a KYC dashboard. We're building that at the moment. And we have very recently gone through the Trust Framework accreditation. So we're like fresh out of the packet. And so I'll chip in. I'm try not to overtake too much, but hopefully I think it really would be very helpful. I don't know, obviously I don't know in terms of audience and who knows what about the trust framework, so I think maybe the first question is, what is it? So yeah,
I'm happy to come in with that one. I spent a lot of my time explaining what the trust framework is. So the trust framework is essentially, it's a set of rules that cover the roles, the principles, the policies, procedures and standards, all the good juicy stuff that govern the use of digital identity in the UK. So I think of it as it's the government's answer to what does a good digital identity look like. And it's been written with 5 principles in mind. First of all, it's enabling rather than restricting. So the trust framework is about taking down the barriers that the digital identity market is currently facing rather than putting in new ones. It's about protecting consumers and adding security to online transactions and interactions that we have. We aim for it to be internationally interoperable. So we spend a lot of time talking with our partners around the world, making sure that we're keeping pace with the rest of the globe, but also, creating some benchmarks and setting standards as well. It's outcome based. So we are technology agnostic. We don't really mind if you're doing what kind of glitzy, fancy technical solution you've come up with in and of itself. If you can meet the requirements in the trust framework, then you're able to get certified. And fundamentally, we're also not trying to reinvent the wheel with this. So the trust framework, it's not us sitting down and coming up with brand new shiny standards about how things should be. Instead, we're using and building on existing standards that are already out there. We know that there's a lot of good work going around, and it's our job to bring that all together and create that list of this is what a good digital identity looks like. We'll pause there. I'm sure there's loads of details and loads more to add into that, but I'll let that sit as it is. And yeah, if anyone wants to pick up on anything I've said, then happy to talk more.
Yeah, I think one of the things I suppose with the digital identity is that it's evolving, isn't it? It's an evolving technology. So as in making sure that, you know, what might be now is also going to be, the trust framework is also going to be useful for the future is a really important thing. I think we'll probably touch on that a little bit later in the discussion. But actually, if we has anyone else got any thoughts on that? What makes up, how does it work in the digital identity ecosystem? What are the key elements maybe of a trust framework?
Yeah, so I'll pitch in here some really key elements that we found, and this is just going by client feedback. One of the key elements we found is flexibility in the trust framework. I think Victoria gave a bit of an example there where they're saying it doesn't matter what technology you use as long as it operates within the boundaries of the trust framework. So you have that freedom to be creative in terms of the technology used to produce that product in terms of digital ID verification. We also find one of the key elements is anti-fraud management. I think that was a big one amongst clients, especially in the financial sector, how the trust framework actually deals with fraud, or well, not how the framework deals with fraud, but how it examines how our clients would deal with fraud. That's a big key element.
And would you say, sorry to interject, Dion, would you say it's that differs as well from a traditional security framework that you would normally see in your work?
There are slight differences, excuse me, but I think the principles are the same, but the differences account for the technology. Obviously, the different ways we detect fraud and how we manage fraud. For example, if we found a fraudulent account, how does the client handle that? Do they immediately get rid of the account or anything linked to the account? Those type of things, the actions and steps you take. And what we're seeing is that the framework should keep step with all of these security considerations as they evolve, and maybe as fraud threats they themselves evolve, because we're really dealing with an arms race. So yeah, and I think one of the other key elements we found in the framework is that it's based on a lot of good standards that we have already in place, like the information security standard, or the quality management standard, or the risk management standard. They're all there. You don't have to actually have specific ISO standards for them, but you must have a quality management system in place. Or similarly, you must have some sort of risk management in place. And we find that because these things are already established, their principles have been tried and tested, it's a good pillar to have underpinning the trust framework.
Yeah, they're good foundations, aren't they? And they also make it quite, you know, everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people know what ISO 27001 is. Yeah. And so when I know that it's been quite useful for us, definitely, when we've been explaining what the trust framework is that actually we can say, well, it's this standard and this standard and this standard. And so you basically, people go, right, okay, now I'm building up that picture of what the fundamentals are. And that's really useful. But also that it isn't starting from scratch again and throwing everything out. And
yeah, that's what Victoria had mentioned before. And there's also the inclusion of good practice guides. I don't know how many people in the audience would know about the good practice guides, GPG 44 and 45. But again, it's something that will evolve. And what we found is that some of the clients, because they've been operating in this particular space for a while, they already adhere to the principles in the good practice guide.
It might be just quite useful to just say what the good practice guides, GPG 44 and 5 are, just in case people don't know in the audience. Is that a back to Victoria one?
Yeah, I can briefly summarize. They are they're guides about how you verify someone's identity and how you authenticate someone's identity. So, you know, it is actually that the person whose identity you're checking matches so the person you have in front of you is really the person they say they are. And
those guides they're not a new thing. That's
yes, I think I'm doing that. To my understanding is correct, that they've been around for a little bit, right?
Yeah, they've been around for a while. But that's the point that I was trying to make, that some of the clients, they have been doing the things in the guides for such a long time, you know, and that's what makes them so tried and tested.
Yeah.
And obviously the clues in the title, you know, good practice.
Yeah. And
I like how they branded that. It's really
yeah, did you know?
Something that's worth pointing to with to the GPG45 that really shows that flexibility is within GP45 you have confidence levels. So different situations where you're checking someone's identity require you're willing to accept different levels of confidence and different levels of risk in those situations. So if someone is if you need to know that someone's over 18 because they've put a bottle of wine in their online Tesco order, that's a different situation to proving someone's identity when they're buying a house. The risk that's involved in there and the consequences are really different. And so with GPG45, there are these different confidence levels. So you can have higher or lower confidence levels of different, depending on the documents that people are using to check their identity. And so that means that it's not meaning that for absolutely every time you use digital identity, you need the most secure biometric passport, because that's just not always going to be appropriate. And by building in the GPG 44 and 45 into the trust framework, we have that flexibility to recognise the diversity of situations that people are using digital identities. And yeah, having that flexibility, as Dion kind of pointed out, is a real strength of the trust framework.
Yeah, and I suppose that's one of what, like, that's sort of that going back to the question, which is about the key elements. That's that each use case is slightly different, isn't it? So being able to recognize within the framework, that within the framework is definitely very important. So Mark, I know you've been sat there quietly for the last few minutes, which
makes a change.
Yeah, is that unusual? But so I'm going to throw this one over to you. But how can organisations leverage these frameworks to improve their digital identity management practices and enhance the user experience?
It's a really interesting question. It's a question that kind of forms two parts there. You know, how can organizations leverage the trust framework, and then what is the impact going to be on the end users and the consumers going through the processes that those organizations put in place? I guess, you know, regulation and guidance around customer onboarding and customer verification has existed since I've worked in this industry back to 2009 or whatever it was. And it's been really interesting to see how that has evolved. What the trust framework gives organizations is structure. You know, the regulation and the guidance as it existed before was extremely grey, and there was a lot of uncertainty around tolerances and levels of risk and what data is acceptable. The trust framework gives organizations now certainty around a process that they go through, whether that's pinned off GPB 44, 45. It gives them that structure, and it also then flows into the consumer. That structure then gives the consumer consistency in how they expect to engage with these organizations, consistency in how they expect to be verified, how they expect to be managed in terms of how their data is handled. It's a really interesting concept. It's one that's existed in other jurisdictions for a little bit longer than it's existed here. But it's really, really, it's really, really powerful in enabling businesses to transact safely online, but also to give consumers confidences in businesses that are transacting online, that if they're using a supplier that's certified, they're going through a process which has been stress tested and gives them certainty around how their data is being used, what levels they need to be verified to. And there's a whole spin off the back of that. It's confidence in the market, it's confident in the industries, and it applies out to the regulation that then sits behind those industries, whether it's for age verification, whether it's for anti-money laundering, whatever purposes it is that you might be verifying somebody.
And that's not going away, is it? The increasingly digitized world that we live in, we need to have frameworks like this. It's just an absolute must as we try and do more transactions online. I think when we had a conversation before, Mark, about like the history of, look, if you look back 10 years ago, I won't take it off you because you did it 10 years ago, where we were and what we did online. We're just like a completely different world.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? 10 years ago, you couldn't open a bank account without physically visiting a branch. There was a handful of maybe online presences, maybe online gaming, or a few sectors or industries that were just starting to accept kind of digital onboarding. But often there were still processes that pinned in the background that required documentation or paper. And when you compare that now, where you can have a Monzo online banking account, other banks are available in less in less than 3 or 4 minutes. It's a totally different dynamic, and with that change in dynamic brings whole new world of challenges.
Yeah. So challenges, that's a good thing to talk about, probably.
Can I just, before we move on, can I just leap in with just an extra thing to say about how organizations can leverage, and actually, Shelley, maybe this is something you might be able to speak to as well, just having gone through the process, is that we also think about the trust framework as sort of providing a level of assurance to digital identity providers that they're doing the right thing, that it gives you sort of a list of the things that you need to be doing in order to know that your service is providing a good level of privacy, security, fraud prevention, inclusion, that kind of thing. And where organizations aren't meeting that, is pointers on how they can improve, and it's then assurance to relying parties as well, and kind of give it sort of pointing in a direction of travel as well, is also how we sort of think about organizations being able to leverage it.
Yeah, I mean, we really found it was once we figured it out, which took a little bit of time, we really did find that it was it made us have to deal with all of these different topics at once, because that is the product that we were building anyway. So making sure we had covered everything off, it was actually really, really useful and huge. Not gonna lie, huge, but it was really it was actually a really useful thing to have that sort of sat in front of you to say, you need to do all of this, are you doing it? And we had some, the team and I had some incredible conversations, and some of them can go into especially fraud, which is like, it's the reason that we're doing it all, so that's a really important thing to tackle in depth and in detail. But it's how many ways can you defraud something? And I mean, and you have to think in a different mindset for that one as well, maybe. So one of the challenges certainly that sort of I found in the trust framework is because it is quite new. So and one of the reasons why we're doing this panel discussion today was because it was something that I thought was really important. So we've gone through this accreditation, and what does that mean? And do people know what that means? And do people know how that does work in real life? Because it's all well and good us going through it, but if everyone goes, oh yeah, well, great, good for you, like it's not actually useful. So one of those really important aspects was to try and raise the profile of what the trust framework is. Obviously it's in beta at the moment, so and there's a piece of legislation that's running alongside this, but I would say that's probably a challenge that I'm trying to help solve, right? Bringing you all together, but and we need to do more of. But what other challenges maybe associated with implementing trust frameworks, or this of the UK DIATF one, and how can they be addressed, I think is my next question. I don't know if there's anyone wants to jump in on that, or
I guess there's two sides to that, isn't there? Well, three, I guess. You've got the challenges faced by organizations like ourselves, which are trying to adhere and comply with those. There are the challenges faced by the bodies that are certifying it and understanding what's available, what's not available, the nuances across all the providers providing that, and the challenges from the government to stay abreast of enhancing technology and
that's it. No one's getting out of answering this question. You've all got to provide a response to this one.
Pretty much.
You can thank Mark for that. But yes, I agree. There is. So well, I sort of just went through one of our challenges, but one of you, actually, Mark, what's the sort of main challenge you've come across?
I mean, I guess it's difficult to say an exact one, but I know going through the process that there's nuances quite across the industry in terms of how the providers use data, the responses against the data that they're checking against look like, and then thus layering that with a standard approach means that terminology might differ, but functionality might be the same, and also bringing products and services maybe into our platform and ecosystem that we've not traditionally needed to comply with anti-money laundering regulation or gaming regulation. So I guess the challenges from our perspective were to make sure that our product was up to scratch to get certified to the level that we need to be certified to, and that we have a full understanding of what the actual framework is asking of us in each different step.
Yeah, and if I jump onto Victoria there, because one of the things that I really appreciated is the open communication. So I was at DSIT HQ in London a few weeks ago, having a discussion about a certain aspects of within the trust framework, and it was great to have that real, like, the government are not saying here we have the answer right now, and this is, we know that engagement in between people that are actually on the coal face of it, and how their customers are taking their sort of requirements as well, though the relying parties that are having to also be part of this trust framework as well, because it does span the whole ecosystem. So that's a good thing. But
no, so that kind of comes out of the big challenge that we have, is that as policymakers we are approaching this at very much like the macro level. We are operating on very like principle, policy, rules based approaches, and we can sit in Whitehall and go inclusion, privacy, fraud prevention, these all sound like pretty good, we should they all sound good, we'll put them in the trust framework. But because we're not down in the technical nitty-gritty, it's entirely possible that we're actually sat there writing rules that can't be technically implemented, or are really contradictory, or doesn't offer the market any more clarity. And so throughout the development of the trust framework, it's been really key that this has been a really iterative process that's based on engagement with industry and with our stakeholders. So we engage with over 300 stakeholders. And so this is identity service providers like yourself, it's civil society organizations, academics, relying parties. And it gives us a chance to write up our proposals, take them out to all of you lot, say, what do you think of this? We get your feedback, we really listen to it, and we update it in response to that. And what this engagement looks like, it takes so many forms, and you're very generous in giving so much of your time in taking part of this with us. We're really grateful to our stakeholders for that. We recognise that this is a very much a two-way relationship, and so we've hosted large in-person events where we get you sat down for a whole day, sort of talking through different scenarios and different issues that you're facing. We do regular engagement calls. I actually think the ones for this month are happening this week. We have a digital sandbox, which has meant that we've got a whole load of synthetic data of completely made up identities, and we've got loads of different identity providers involved, and we're running that synthetic data through their systems to have a look at how's the market operating as a whole, where are the issues coming up, and that's about testing the framework rather than testing the individual providers. We have a public dialogue happening that's just wrapped up, so that was about 90 hours of discussion with members of the public, getting their view on this. And we've also just completed a survey exercise to get some quantitative data, and that's my task this afternoon, is sitting down and reading through all of that. So this iterative approach, it's about making sure that we actually do have an effective framework that isn't just policymakers coming up with a good idea that is completely divorced from the reality on the ground. And that having that, what we really hope also through that iteration is that the market has real confidence in the trust framework as well, because if it's just sat there and no one wants to use it and no one thinks it works, then all of our effort is wasted and it's pointless.
I will cry if that happens. That would be so let's not let that happen. And I very much from the other side of it, very much appreciate that dialogue, because it is really important for us to be able to have a voice in these things. So that's amazing. Before we head over to Dion to answer the question, I'm just going to mention, so Charles asked a question. I'll try and get to that at the end, Charles. So if you can manage to hang around till the end, or you can pick up the recording of the webinar. Keep calling it a webinar. It's not technically a webinar. It's the trust framework. Over to you, Dion, before I say anything else that doesn't make sense.
Sure. So I would like to continue from Victoria's end, only because there are two big challenges that always come up on Victoria's side. And that is, the first one is the whole jurisprudence around the trust framework, meaning the legal clauses and legal powers that give the trust framework its foundational power, really, its bite. You know, you have to have laws that enable us to have this regulatory framework in place and maintain the regulatory framework. And as you all know, the big challenge with making new laws and passing new laws is the whole thing about getting them through Parliament. So that's a big challenge for Victoria's team. Excuse me. Excuse me. And the second part that's related to that is the international presence of the framework. You know, because of the product that we're talking about here and the product that we're looking at, and I'm sure you can appreciate, Shelley, it crosses geographical boundaries easily, which means then that how do we know which law supersedes which law, or which law is the one that you would follow or adhere to? And I think government is making steps in terms of speaking with international partners, and that's probably something that they'll have to agree on, sort out, or even develop. And I think those two are some really big challenges I see to the framework: getting the jurisprudence in place and also establishing the framework as an international framework, essentially. Forgive me for reusing the term. But I think it can be done, because we have to remember part of this whole movement of having a digital economy across all countries will require things like cybersecurity and cyber hygiene and cyber postures, and now for digital verification services. It's all part of the whole digital economy that we see countries leveraging. So it has to be done, essentially. So moving on to challenges on my end, which is the certifying body, where we have persons such as SQR coming to us saying, look, we want to be certified to the trust framework. What's the challenge you would see in an exercise such as that? Well, one of the first challenges you will always get is when clients have to actually look at the framework and see if there's anything they have to do internally and adjust to that. For some, it's easy because they're familiar with doing assessments, and for others, it could be a very stressful exercise. We've tried to get past this challenge by saying to clients, look, you can have a gap analysis. We've broken it down to stage 1 and stage 2. If we find anything mean in stage 1, you can have maybe some time between the next stage to fix it. So that was a big one. And obviously, because the framework is new, we did find a lot of that. The other challenge is the framework itself changing. Now, the framework has to change. It has to keep step with the market, with technologies and response to threats. But that means that if we've certified someone prior to the change, will it impact the assessments going forward? And this is a concern because, again, excuse me, it could involve a lot of time and money on the client side. So what we've done, and government has helped a little bit, they've said the certificates need to be 2 years. And so in the 2 years, there'll be a surveillance and then a recertification. And we've decided upon the point of recertification, we'll upgrade to the latest version of the trust framework. And so what that means is the upgrades are usually small increments. It's not going to be the first time the client would hear about it, because they would have had an ongoing surveillance report. So essentially, it would be, okay, guys, we're doing the audit now in the first year, but we do know about some updates coming up, so please get ready for them. And then when we recertify, again, they would be able to recertify easily.
Yeah, and I think everyone in the ecosystem is also aware that things are changing, and that's important in this area. I think everyone is alive to that, so it's a challenge because we've got to figure it out. But actually, everyone's on board. I would say everyone's on board with that it should be changing. Yeah. Unless you're just very optimistic or very.
No, it has to be like that, and And you will find that the clients who operate in the financial space, they are very much ahead of the curve when it comes to things like the fraud management. You know, they do not have any hesitancy in changing
there anyway.
more
Yeah, it's
secure.
something that they have to tackle every day.
So just coming in with the sort of like the two different challenges that you highlighted there, Dion, on the like legislation side and the sort of the rate of change. And we have a beautiful part where those two cross over really nicely, which is part of the legislation that's going through months past. Will mean that the trust framework will be reviewed annually. And we don't think about, you know, there's going to be a final version of the trust framework and that's it, and it's never going to get touched again. The legislation will really support us to be able to continuously look at what's happening in this market, what needs to be changed, where is the trust framework now falling short. I think it's going to keep a lot of people busy for many, many years to come.
Yeah, I like that position, Victoria. And one of the things that I want to commend the government on is that use of the sandbox testing. I think a lot of the feedback for change that you're going to get is going to come through that sandbox testing, as well as consulting, and not just consulting with certifying bodies or maybe other governments, but also with interest groups, big players in the market, small players in the market, medium size. You know, if you could get a good survey of everyone who the trust framework serves, I think that will also form a good base for improvement going forward. And maybe you might need to do it regularly with small groups or every so often with big groups, but getting the market pulse is very important.
Oh, I like that phrase, market pulse. I'm going to start using it more. So some of the best practices for building and maintaining a trust framework, in your opinion, shall I go back to Mark on this one as well? So probably maintaining might be from your perspective from GBG. So yeah, best practices that maintain a trust framework is effective, secure and privacy respecting.
I think we started to touch on it, certainly Dion and Victoria, at the back end of what they were just saying there, which is not just keeping abreast of the regulation and the changes, but keeping abreast of the industry and the technology and the techniques used by fraudsters, which is, you know, essentially what we're here to try and prevent. I think that's going to be the main thing, and we've talked about the sandbox that exists and the feedback that goes into it and the work going into the framework to ensure that it's ever evolving, and that keeps up the theme with how the identity industry has been for the last 10-15 years, which is ever evolving. We talked about it before. You know, the way that you open a bank account previously to the way that you open a bank account now is so fundamentally different, and the risks associated with those processes have changed so much over time. So the technology supports the industry, supports the risk, supports the processes, and that's you know, that's where the best practices will be found in the industry in terms of what IDSPs like ourselves are doing to help combat fraud and to help make those processes better for the consumer.
Yeah, and I actually think you know, that consumer is at the heart of what and why we're doing this, and not to forget that. I think that would be my 2 pence. So yeah, that you know, making sure that they are as protected as possible, and that they are able to use and transact online in a safe way, and actually we can improve that safety and that experience, so not only can be efficient and effective. And you know, like I had to get cash out the other day and I'm like, what is this?
Yeah.
what is this thing that I'm holding in my hand, you know? And it's so bizarre as a consumer as well, myself, of technologies like this, that we are sometimes maybe unaware of the things that we share. So I think the trust framework has to give that stability, security, that maybe as a consumer you maybe don't even think about when you're wanting, I don't know, to download a new cat video and you're putting all your information in or whatever, you know. So it's that sort of importance of making sure we're protecting the consumer in ways that maybe they don't even realize they need protecting at sometimes.
Yeah. I think it's also an opportunity to make things better for the consumer. You know, you can take a whole range of processes across a whole subset of sectors that these services apply to. And if you take one like the conveyancing process around buying a house, you think about how many times you go through what is effectively a trust framework process. You do it with your solicitor, you do it with your mortgage broker, you do it with your lender. You possibly then have to do it again if another solicitor or another party is involved. It could be 3 or 4 times that you end up providing that same information, going through a similar level of checks.
Or on holiday, so not even buying a house. It's not a big purchase. It's like you want to go on holiday, and then you book your flight, you book your hotel, you book your car hire, and all of those times they're giving the same information away each time. So the ability to be able to have a digital identity where you can say, yeah, look, I am who I say I am. You can trust that because of this framework exists. So yeah, absolute opportunities.
Yeah, I think the best practices around keeping that in the forefront of mind and what it can go on to enable actually is going to have lots of benefits for consumers and businesses as well, because those processes are paid for 3 or 4 times over.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Anyone else, any best practices for building, maybe building for Victoria?
Yeah, I think something that I touched on at the beginning is sort of recognizing that our role isn't to reinvent the wheel, and that there is already so much really good practice out there. So just taking privacy as an example, we work really closely with the ICO, partly because we're going to have a legal duty to consult with them, but also because they're the leading voice on privacy, and we point off to a lot of ICO guidance, and we regularly consult with them. So we're staying abreast of the kind of best practice out there to build in. And again, it's just that wide principle of working with as many stakeholders as we can, and taking everyone along the way with us has been what has made the trust framework the success that it currently is.
Yeah, I would echo that, and especially because I've seen that firsthand, working with stakeholders. There is a lady named Carol Buttle, and yes, I'm name dropping her because she is really, really good at what she's doing. I'm so impressed with her. And one of the things she did, we had a question come up about the biometric technology. Obviously, the biometric technology can help identify a person or confirm a person's identity. And because there was a question about how do we use it, what clauses will go across the biometric spectrum, and is there a test for it, etc. And the answer wasn't readily available, but Carol immediately knew who she would have to speak to, as in the technology leaders for biometrics, as well as those who have used them, as well as those who have tested and assessed these technologies. So essentially what we have here is some person who is well connected to individual stakeholders for an important technology that we would see come into the framework. And I was very impressed by that.
And Carol, just so I suppose Carol works for DCIT?
She works with DCIT now. At the time this had happened was DCMS. And I think that's what frameworks like this, that's ever changing and dependent on the dynamic environment of technology, that's what you need. Someone who knows the guys who are at the bleeding edge of technology and technological developments. Yeah.
Oh, Carol, that's a real nice shout out for Carol.
I'll pass it on, Dion.
You have to let her know, Victoria. So I'm just going to pick up on the question from Charles if we are able to answer it, but I suppose it's 2 parts really, and the second part we might not be able to get to if we can't get past the first. But he said, I heard by law that the UK government is not allowed to use a single ID to identify a citizen across all government departments. Is that true? I don't know. Does someone?
So we don't have a centralized identity system in the UK. So lots of countries, other countries in Europe, you'll have a citizen, you'll have your identity card, and you go to the hospital or whatever, and that stems from having that centralized identity system. And there's a long history of the UK's relationship with identity in centralised systems, but yeah, we don't have one. It's very much government policy that we don't, and that's not at all what this policy is working towards. And actually the trust framework is something that's very much in response to that approach of not having that sort of identity card. And it's therefore is about is recognising that our identity system's quite fractured. So, you know, you've got your passport and your driving license and my NHS records, and they're all held in different government data sets, and held, yeah. And so the trust framework and having this sort of market-led digital identity is a way of people being able to kind of collate all of that information across all the different data sets that it lies and use that, if that makes sense. But basically, to answer your question, no, we don't have a centralized identity system, and the trust framework is a response to that and making identity a little bit smoother than it can currently be in the UK sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Charles.
I could contribute a little bit here in terms of the implication to the trust framework. I don't see it as something that will impact the trust framework, because all clients so far, if you look at when they create an identity, I think one of the things that they have to adhere to is the confidence level, the identity that they can produce. And the confidence level so far has been high in nearly every client. If it's not high, it's going to be very high. And that means that you have to produce more than one type of identity proofing. And it has to have strong data on it, meaning a verifiable date of birth or any historical references where it was being checked. So I think the framework already depends on multiple identity proofing, which is more rigorous and very, very strong. And all clients so far as I could see, and looking at the certificates that have been published, they have already gone to a high confidence level, or very high.
And that sort of tapping into some of the technology that GBG have, probably a good segue into Mark having a little comment on this as well.
I mean, it's interesting listening to you talk about that. There's two kind of questions that come from me as somebody that's close but not that close to the framework. I've been in the industry, like I said, nearly 14 years, and one of the challenges that we face is that segmentation of data, and IDSPs like ourselves not being able to necessarily use it and consolidate it into a single place for our partners and our customers, the organizations that use us to verify. Does that open up an opportunity for things like driver's license databases, national insurance number databases, NHS number databases, to be facilitated to some trusted service providers to allow a single point of checking, if you like, if you were to have a checklist of databases that you want to authenticate for a process? Is that something that's on the framework's mind?
So yes, I don't know how kind of fully detailed I'm able to sort of just like in a position in terms of the wider work that I know about to answer this question. But I would say is that, so one of the benefits of getting certified is that eventually you'll be able to, identity providers are going to be able to do basically kind of ping certain government data sets to check and kind of get like yes no answers back of being like, can Victoria Baines drive? And they'll get back no she can't. And it will be yeah, and so there'll be sort of ways to be able to begin to access the different sort of pots of data that there are, but yeah, we're sort of, the advantage of not bringing that all together is that we don't have these honeypots of data that you have if you have more centralized systems, which is, so the sort of decentralized way that we have it adds friction, but it does protect users by not putting all of their valuable information in one place, and means that if one part of the system fails, like if there's, if there's like the passport office, collapsed, there would still be other data elsewhere, and we don't have a single point of failure. So swings and roundabouts to our approach, but yeah, hopefully in the trust framework and moving towards digital identity market starts to reduce that friction and makes it easier for that information to be sort of routed to the identity provider.
I'm gonna have to stop you there because we're coming up to, well, we literally are finished. But what's been nice is that we've been able to talk about the future a little bit of what Trust Framework looks like as well, which is amazing. So great question, Charles. Thank you very much. It's yeah, we could talk for a lot longer. And it's been absolutely fascinating. And thank you all so much for giving up your time to give us a bit of an education on the Trust Framework, and also the benefits, the challenges. It's just been a bit of a whirlwind 45 minutes, but hopefully the audience has got a lot of information out of this. And if all of us are available on LinkedIn on our, if you have any further questions, or if you did ping them to Digital Leaders, I'm sure they'll find their way back to us somehow. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.